Ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to this discussion on The Too Difficult Box, which is a book which immediately attracted my attention because I've long enjoyed my dialogue with Charles Clarke from his period when he was Education Secretary and then latterly as Home Secretary. He's always been a most engaging person with whom to discuss the matters. I said earlier when he came to talk to some staff here that he's always struck me as a wonderful teacher, and I think this has wonderful teaching aspects in it, this book. He's going to talk a few minutes on the criteria for what constitutes the too difficult box. I'm going to ask him a few questions, and then I'm going to throw it open to the floor in the time-honoured fashion. So, Charles, always welcome here. Look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Well, Dean, firstly, thank you very much for inviting me. I very much appreciate it, and thanks to all of you for taking the trouble to come this evening. I do appreciate that. I published the book as a result of a set of lectures called The Too Difficult Box, which I held at the University of East Anglia. And the original concept was to try and understand why it was that major problems which people believe ought to be solved are in fact not solved and are put into the too difficult box, was the word I used, and set to one side. And that was partly also to explain a sense of disappointment that some people had that the new Labour government from 1997 to 2010 had failed to achieve some of the things which people had hoped it would achieve. And why was this? I published the book then as a compendium of the different lectures, and the different lecturers wrote chapters of the book, and I set an overall framework. I saw the book as having three real functions. Firstly, as a kind of primer on politics. I think politics is not well understood in this country, it's not well taught in universities, and the problems of a process of political change are not sufficiently analysed. And what I hope to do in this book was describe in a number of areas how the political process had worked or not worked in relation to particular areas of change, and so hopefully, therefore, to get a greater degree of analysis and understanding of how politics was working. Secondly, I wanted to try and shift, to some extent, the concept of what is politics. Too much of our politics, in my mind, is taken up by a sense of theatre, personality, Punch and Judy point scoring in a wide variety of different ways. And that's how many people see politics. Many people in the country see politics. And in fact, in my opinion, politics is about solving the problems of the society, finding ways in which the society's problems can be addressed, ranging from big questions like the Northern Ireland position, the Good Friday process that happened in that, to questions of how the economy is to be run, and so on. And I think that the way in which politics is seen by a lot of commentators about politics is not as it best should be. And then finally, it was a call as a result of that second aspect for democratic politics to really step up to the plate, for democratic politicians to say, well, really, how are we going to solve big problems which our society experiences? Whether it's the ageing society, social care in old age, welfare reform, immigration, a whole range of issues. Can we address and sort out these problems, or are we destined simply to not be able to address them and therefore lead to an increasing disaffection with politics and the political process by millions of people, which is, I think, what we're seeing in this country at the moment, indeed not only in this country, but also in other countries, and the rise of self-centred ultra-right-wing parties, even in some cases fascist parties, which basically say bollocks to the lot of you and make that argument as strongly as they can. And so I was calling to say, actually, on these big questions, democratic politicians have to really come together to try and ensure we can solve them and address them, rather than simply putting them into the too difficult box. The process that I identified in my introductory chapter goes through a series of issues. Firstly, to identify the problem that you are trying to solve, which is a lot more difficult than it seems. In the case of immigration, for example, is the problem we're trying to solve too many people coming into this country? Is it too many unskilled people coming into this country? Is it too many people coming from abroad and claiming benefits into this country? Is it the changing nature of our towns and cities? What is the problem you're really trying to solve is not really a straightforward question in the first place. Then secondly, trying to identify the solution to the problem. And there will be lots of perfectly legitimate argument about what is the solution to the kind of problem that you are trying to solve. If you don't know what solution you're trying to achieve, then it's very difficult to solve the problem you're about trying to address. But often there's not a very direct and clear understanding of what the solution is. The third problem is then the challenge of implementation. And the scale of this varies enormously. The example I give in the chapter is the variation between trying to change health commissioning and a health commissioning process, which was a proposal at the early stage of this government, which essentially required handing over £80 billion of public expenditure to GP practices to decide how they might be spent. Or to take a completely different example, giving prisoners the right to vote. There are entirely different scales of problems in implementing those things. We've got a classic implementation issue just at the moment. If there is a Scottish yes vote on Thursday, how will that then be implemented, and what will be the process which then happens that we go through in those circumstances? If, in fact, the implementation isn't as easy to solve as some people think, then, of course, the problem ends up getting put into the too difficult box because we can't solve it because we can't implement it. The fourth aspect in this hierarchy is the problem of overcoming vested interests. There are always vested interests who oppose any change, and it's an iron rule of politics that the people who are opposed to a change will shout very loudly about it, and the people who benefit from a change will say not very much. And the people who are opposed will make a big case. They will normally assert that they're opposed to it because the public interest is being threatened by the proposed change, though often there are personal and direct interests involved in the change as well. Vested interests can be extremely effective at mobilising their arguments in given situations, and it's a real issue for any politician trying to promote change to deal with those vested interests when they come along. Again, if you can't overcome the vested interests, it may be that you decide to abandon the policy altogether. An example in the Labour government, shortly after I finished as Education Secretary, was the idea of setting up schools which were more on the academy basis that we've talked about, that we've seen recently. And that was abandoned despite Labour's overall majority in Parliament because the vested interests were able to stop that change coming about. Fifthly, what are the legal constraints? We normally see that in the context at the moment of the European Convention on Human Rights and the various issues which arise if you're proposing to make changes in certain areas. It's not only in that area, of course, there are other legal constraints which exist. I had to deal with those immediately. I became Home Secretary because just literally the day after, the High Court judged that the arrangements for dealing with people we suspected of planning terrorist actions that had been passed by legislation previously were contrary to law. And so the immediate decision which I had to face was, do I obey the law or not? It should be self-evident that you obey the law, and I in fact decided to obey the law, and we then set about the process of trying to establish control orders, which then led to further controversy down the route. It's not obvious that governments have to obey the law, and there are times on which it's even suggested that the government shouldn't obey the law. I would argue that's a very different, dangerous and difficult course to go down, and I would say that governments should obey the law, and that should be how they conduct themselves. But there can be real legal inhibitions to particular policies that are proposed. One I don't think has been tested in this country recently was the idea of abolishing private schools, and it suggested that under the European Convention on Human Rights that would actually be illegal, and therefore you couldn't abolish private schools because you removed a parent's choice for the education they wanted for their child. That's another classic legal block which stops you proceeding and puts the problem into the too difficult box. There's an international dimension these days to very many problems that arise, and so you may decide you're going to go down a particular course, but then find the international considerations make that very difficult to follow. And so again, that may be a reason to abandon your proposal. You then have the vicissitudes of the political process. about which I think there's a completely insufficient level of understanding. Many politicians, many commentators believe that a government can simply say, we're going to do this. So a speech is made and there's the policy. In fact, you go through a very long process from the speech to the green paper to the white paper to the proposed legislation, then comes into Parliament, goes through committee stage in the Commons, committee stage in the Lords. And at all of those phases, there are changes to the proposal that come along, and there's opposition which is mobilised, and that's one of the virtues, actually, of our parliamentary process, that there is serious scrutiny of proposals when they come along. But the vicissitudes are very real, and again, there are plenty of examples of governments which have pulled a particular policy proposition because it ran into the sand in Parliament, because it hadn't been sufficiently thought through. Again, just to use the Scottish example as its contemporary, I look forward with entertainment and interest to the event of a yes vote and the UK Parliament then considering the Independence of Scotland Bill, which will have to be considered in Parliament, and we can be pretty sure the vicissitudes in that particular case will be entertaining at least and disastrous at worst. And the final stage is the sustaining of political energy. A party leader in the 19th century described the opposition bench as a row of exhausted volcanoes. And the fact is that you can have lots of energy, but it's hard work to make change, to promote change. If you're genuinely conservative with a small c, I don't mean Margaret Thatcherite, but if you're actually conservative, it's not so hard. But if you're actually about promoting change, as governments of all parties can be, it's a very exhausting and difficult process, and you need to have the rub of the green, the confidence of people. And again, you may simply come to the view that it's all too difficult. So those are the stages in what happens, which I set out in the book. And then each chapter, there is an analysis by somebody who's been involved in the field. Some of the chapters I think are very good, others not quite so good, but generally some very good pieces about the problems of this as you try and carry change through. As I say, I think the fundamental reason I edited the book and have run the lecture series is the view that politicians want often to be there caught in the immediate short-term process, but we don't have long-term problems which need to be addressed. And if the short-term political process is operating, then the long-term need may be simply ignored. But for the public, for the people, that's not good enough. If you're trying to establish a proper social care system for old age, just to surrender to the rhetoric of the death tax as you go through doesn't solve the problem. You've got to find a way to address it. And my fear is that if the long-term problems which are important to different parts of the society are not addressed, then bottom line what happens is people get fed up with politics and they think that's not the right way to proceed, and they can look to more extreme versions to move forward. I should emphasise that I don't think this is a disease which is purely afflicting the UK, though I think it is afflicting the UK. There are many examples in the rest of Europe of this kind of problem, and I think the United States at the moment also shows a serious problem with gridlock between Congress and the presidency of an inability to address the problems which are there. And the reasons, I say, why people want politicians and want a democratic politics is to solve the problems the society has. So I conclude, Dean, by saying that what I think is really needed is an absolute desire by the democratic politicians to say we are going to try and solve these tough problems. And of course, by the way, they're all tough. And there's no easy solutions. If there's easy solutions, they'd all be adopted immediately. If there are tough problems, that we should come together and try and address them. And that's what I hope this book will promote discussion around. So that's my introduction. Thank you again for inviting me, and thank you to you for coming.
Thank you. The most obviously salient essay in the book at the moment, perhaps even though very fresh, taken over by events, is former First Minister of Scotland, Jack McConnell. And perhaps it's not too difficult box now, the Scottish issue, depending on what your viewpoint of what way the referendum goes on Thursday. But I'm just interested in the whole issue, perhaps the next too difficult question, which wasn't addressed in McConnell's thing, perhaps there ought to have been a chapter, is the whole question of the English question, English votes, and just interested in your thoughts now.
Well, I mean, he does make that point in a slight way, in which he emphasises the enormous amount of constitutional change we've seen across the UK in the last 15 years. You're talking about a new form of government in London, a new form of government in Wales. You're talking about different electoral systems for just about every part of British local government in various ways, in a way which is essentially quite confusing. And so you do need to take the thing forward. What he argues in his chapter, which I think is correct, is that if you're going to make change, you've got to do it on a properly considered, properly discussed, properly carried forward basis. And in fact, the criticism I have of the referendum question that's there is it's not been honest in the whole debate. The truth is the Scottish people don't have the right, and they won't have the right on Thursday, to vote for independence. The only organisation which can enable independence for Scotland is the UK Parliament. The UK Parliament will have to pass an act which would by hypothesis be called the Governance of Scotland Act or the Scotland Independence Act or something, which actually makes it happen. And that act would have to go through all those complicated issues of how you're dealing with the currency, how you're dealing with the national debt, how you're dealing with the oil, etc., etc., etc. And in fact, the question that's being answered on Thursday is a very loose question of the type, should Scotland be independent? Which actually doesn't address, as the Quebec referendum did previously, giving a mandate to negotiate an independence agreement. And so because of the dishonesty in this whole issue, I think it really risks, whatever the outcome, inflating the cynicism which exists. And that's particularly true on the English question, as you rightly put it. There are various solutions which can be put forward: separate English Parliament, only English MPs voting on English questions, and so on. These are all very difficult and tough problems. Labour, for quite a while, following the devolution settlement, argued for English regional government to be able to, so you've got some kind of parity between devolved Scotland and Wales, and to an extent devolved London, and a kind of devolved English regional government. Indeed, one of your rival think tanks, I think today or yesterday, published something saying Greater Manchester should elect its own government in Greater Manchester and deal with these things. But of course, when there was a referendum to test that in the northeast of England, it was rolled over, and so no progress was taken in that area. I'm certainly of the view that if there were a yes question, the whole English government question would go straight to the top of the agenda. And I, in fact, don't think anything would be able to go through the UK Parliament, as I say it has to, unless there was an answer on the English government question, because I think large groups of MPs, mainly Conservative, but not only Conservative, would say we're not going to pass the Scotland Independence Act unless we're clear what's going to happen to the government of England in these circumstances, and that would be an immediate demand that they would place, thus leading to quite a series of problems in these areas. Now, what would be the form of government of England that would emerge? That would be a political and negotiated process that would take place. Whether you'd have a completely separate parliament, in which case what would be the role of the UK Parliament, and that there's many solutions that could happen. But I think I can't myself see that if Scotland were to be independent, you don't have to fundamentally change the question of English governance on these areas. The key issue, of course, is the tax rate, and that's the fundamental justification for Parliament throughout history. And if income tax were to go entirely to Scotland, I think that would again provoke the case for it. Even in a Devo Max option, if a significant level of income tax setting were to go to Scotland, but without having Scottish independence, that would again raise these questions in a very sharp way. I can't myself see how these solutions are going to be found, because there isn't a consensus about the best way to proceed. But I think trying to legislate the independence of Scotland without some agreement on this will be almost impossible.
Then whether anyone has anything to say on that, since the Hoss's button issue of the day. Gentleman there.
Having been a member of Parliament and also a member of the Scottish Parliament, so a member of both legislatures, I mean, even if there isn't a yes vote on Friday, I think we're in a totally new situation. I mean, not that I have to agree with John Redwood or John Humphreys, but clearly the whole business of Devo Max And, DISARMAMENT couldn't be put on the ballot paper because nobody knew what it meant. It means different things to different parties. They all have different versions. But, with this imbalance, and with the imbalance we now see with London basically virtually a city-state, almost with no relation to the rest of the country, with different forms of devolution in Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, isn't there an argument for something like a constitutional convention? That's what the Scots had prior to the Scottish Parliament. It kind of worked. It helped actually pave the way for the Labour government's bill legislation in '97. Labour took part. The SNP sadly didn't, but the other parties did, and actually helped sort of, if you say, lubricate the whole process. I'm just wondering if that isn't the way forward, because clearly you're not going to, exactly as you're saying, you're not going to get the agreement of Conservative members to this unless they get concessions for England.
I agree, and I think that is the only way forward. There are many good reasons to buy the Two Difficult Box book, which is at the back and on sale at a very, very reasonable price. But one of them is Jack McConnell's article, which Dean described. And he describes the Constitutional Convention process in Scotland and the way that it worked. What I learnt reading it, actually, or when he gave the lecture, which I hadn't appreciated, but you referred to in the question, is all the parties in Scotland are part of the Constitutional Convention process, except the SNP, interestingly, in the whole process. But he argues exactly the same, that we've got to go back to the drawing board for the UK, as it is, and look at this vast variety of different constitutional arrangements which have arisen, all with their own intrinsic justification at the time, and get agreement to move forward. Certainly it would be totally disastrous, in my opinion, to try and legislate on narrow votes in the Commons changes in this area, because they wouldn't be stable. And what you have to go for is some kind of stable solution, and that requires some kind of consent of the process that you're describing. DISARMAMENT, I agree, there's lots of different DISARMAMENTs, and nobody fully understands what it is. I personally think the Gordon Brown-led agreements of the last week on this are very dangerous, because I think at the end of the day, we don't know what we mean by DISARMAMENT, and so a great demand has been put in place, even if, as I hope, the no vote is passed, for a process on a very sharp timetable, actually, for where we go. And I don't myself see any need for a sharp timetable, but all the Prime Minister, the Leader of the Opposition, Nick Clegg, have all agreed to some kind of quick process in this area, because they've been panicked by what the opinion polls on the Scottish vote. But I personally think you're right, there has to be some kind of overall constitutional settlement if we're to move forward in that way.
Thank you. One other question arises. Much of your public career, you've dealt with the issue of religion in politics, the effects thereof, as Education Secretary dealing with faith schools, Home Secretary obviously dealing with aspects of religion in politics across many different spaces, including also in the counter-terrorism area. Just wondering why you didn't consolidate all of that into one chapter in there.
I should have done, really. It was a mistake in my own brain. I did this as visiting professor of politics at the University of East Anglia. I'm also visiting professor of politics and faith at the University of Lancaster, because they have the only faculty, politics, philosophy and religion, which brings those things together. I'm not a man of faith myself. I'm agnostic stroke atheist in my beliefs, but I do believe, for the reason exactly that you said, that faith is very, very important in our national life and is important to discuss. And in fact, I believe more seriously than that most of government, most politics, most government simply doesn't understand about faith at all and doesn't discuss the question widely. We decided to set up a set of events called the Westminster Faith Debates, of which there have been 3 series now. The first on faith and public life, the second on faith and individual life, running from abortion, contraception through to assisted dying, and then this spring on the international dimensions. They were very well attended, and shockingly in a way, many people came to them from around here saying we don't feel able to discuss religion or faith at all in our office or working environment here. It's almost completely unacceptable. And it was very moving to hear people saying that they wanted to talk about it and to understand it. And so I kind of blocked it into a different side of my mind, and that's the answer to your question. We could certainly have done a very good one on establishment of the Church of England, which is a classic issue in this area. But also we could have taken broader subjects about, quotes, multicultural society or whatever, in a way that's important. But as I say, if you're interested in these debates, it's just Google Westminster Faith Debates, and they're quite interesting in that area. But you're right that it's a central question which is insufficiently addressed and needs to be better understood, and they would have been a very good subject for one of these chapters.
Thread. Gentleman there. Name and organisation, please.
Thanks very much, Dean. My name is Major General Tim Cross, so ex-British Army, but I chair the board of Theos, which joined in with the Westminster Forum.
And played a very important role.
And Dean has preempted my question, actually, and I think it's a significant omission. And any politician, I would like to say statesman, but if I'm brutal, I don't think we have many statesmen around, need to understand these issues in the 21st century, and we're seeing the reality of that played out in the Middle East at the moment, and will continue to do so, I suppose. So I just want to support the comment. I think it's a glaring omission. I think it's a sad omission. I think that your comment about the reality of this place, Whitehall, Westminster, which I operate in a bit, the reality is that for most people operating around here, they do not understand this issue, they do not want to understand this issue, and they believe that nobody else in the world is interested in it, and they are fundamentally flawed. And it's an issue that will come back to haunt us, I think, for many years to come.
I agree with all of that, with one, including the self-criticism, except I think that the issue is moving a little bit in the right direction. I think there is more of a discussion about this than there was 2 or 3 years ago, and I think that that's a good thing. Nothing like enough. Interesting people we're involved with, trying to promote discussion in different areas. Theos played an extremely important role in organising these debates, and it is itself. I know no other think tank can possibly match Policy Exchange in its general wisdom. That is correct.
Look at that.
But Theos does a very good job in trying to do precisely that.
Gentleman there at the front. At the front.
Robert Rosencrantz. I'm from America, and I wanted to bring an American perspective to this discussion. By coincidence, there's a recently published book by a distinguished scholar at Yale, Peter Schuck, called Why Government Fails So Often. And I'm going to just, if you bear with me, read a couple of sentences from the Wall Street Journal Review that I think kind of gives the flavor of this. Quote, to be successful, he argues, a public policy has to get 6 things right: incentives, instruments, information, adaptability, credibility, and management. The federal government tends to be bad at all of these. Take Medicare, a popular program. By paying a set fee for each service, it creates perverse incentives for doctors to perform more of them. Then, by using the instrument of price controls to limit costs, it creates shortages. By setting those prices administratively, it denies itself the information that only the interplay of supply and demand can offer. By imposing a mid-1960s insurance model on American medicine, it makes the healthcare system inflexible. By relying on payment cuts that Congress routinely puts off, it makes a joke of its own fiscal projections. And by abiding billions in fraud, it invites waste and abuse. The sum of all of this is a colossal mess at the heart of American healthcare. So my question is whether perhaps what you're describing is not so much a problem in the UK, but a broader problem of advanced democracies across the developed world.
It's a profound question, and there's an interesting book similar to what you're describing by Anthony King, Blunders of UK Governments, on similar issues here. But let me just say, firstly, I read the book. I'm very glad for the reference to it. And just to say, I have seriously thought about trying to do a Too Difficult box in the US context. I was in Washington in July and talking to some people about this. And with the gridlock that you have at the moment, I think there are real issues, classic being the gridlock on immigration, for example, and what's happening there. But I think there's a slight difference between what this book's talking about and what you've just described, which is that this book is about the failings of politicians and the political structure for dealing with long-term issues, and the short-term problem and long-term issues. The kinds of issues you're describing there are more about failures of government, which is slightly different to the failings of politics. And in my opinion, to get the government to succeed, you've got to get the politics to work. And that requires there's some efforts to go past the democratic politicians. I mean, an example in this country is the setting of the interest rate by the Monetary Policy Committee, independent from government, was to take decisions away on a technocratic basis from democratic politicians. Good thing, bad thing. Actually, I think that particular decision was a good thing. But there's a whole set of issues here about what's the role of politics in relation to the technocratic decision structures that run major public institutions such as Medicare or here the NHS or whatever it may happen to be. And that's a very big discussion. My view of that is that if you simply take these things away from democratic politics, then at the end of the day, democratic politics will simply attack the technocratic systems in a way which isn't constructive. And you've got to go about a different way of trying to get the democratic political system to be more responsive. I certainly agree with your final point that this is not a question limited to the UK. It absolutely applies in other advanced democracies as well. But if you were to look at the health of democracy in UK, Germany, France, Italy, United States, Canada, Australia, whatever examples you choose, there's nowhere that I'd say, well, there's a really good story to tell, it's going great. Partly it's because of the short-term, long-term issue, that most of these problems are long-term problems, not short-term problems, whereas the politicians are focused on the short-termist agenda of the immediate election campaign that's coming up in the next 2, 3, 4 years. But partly it's the whole nature of the conduct of politics has been transformed by 24/7 media and immediate responsibility in a wide range of areas. So the days when politicians could sit back with their advisors in some way and then say, okay, we're going to do it that way or the other way, just don't exist now because of the way the media operates. And the media doesn't consider it has a responsibility to promote good government. It considers it has a responsibility to promote accountability in whatever form that it operates. So I think there are 2 or 3 factors which would support your proposition that it's a generic problem rather than a particular UK problem. But that doesn't excuse us, because actually, whether you're talking about the Tea Party or whatever they're called in the States, or UKIP here, there's a whole set of responses which have a lot of popular appeal, which I would say are negative and introverted rather than looking at how you solve the bigger problems. And I think actually at the moment it's absolutely acute in foreign policy if you look at many of the issues we're having to deal with right at this very moment. And you've got to get beyond that. Now, that's why I say, certainly in the UK, but I would also say I'm less qualified to say this in other countries. I'd certainly say in the US, though, for politicians and politics has to step up to the plate and find ways of politics addressing these long-termist issues.
Lady there in the middle aisle towards the front. Name and organisation, please.
Elaine Simpson, amongst other things, I chair the National Children's Bureau. I want to take it in the other direction, really, from the gentleman sitting in front of me, which is down to the organisational issue. Because as one of my roles, I sit as a non-exec director on a specialist hospital trust. And what we find very frequently is that things are parked in the too difficult box, and particularly if they're complex, if they're interconnected, if there are potentially adverse outcomes from taking action, people will just stick it in the box, and you'll then sit for 2 or 3 years discussing it and doing nothing. And I think my question is twofold. I think, first of all, much of what you said has got huge relevance to trying to ensure that people don't just park things in the too difficult box and that they actually try and tackle it. But the second thing is, how on earth can politics and policy ensure that people don't get away with just parking it in the too difficult box when it is something that's impacting on outcomes for people right the way across?
To deal with the second point first, I think the problem is the penalties of unsuccessful action or for unsuccessful action are much greater than the penalties for inaction. I often argue, and many politicians will argue, that their costs applied to doing nothing just as well as their costs applied to doing something. But the fact you have to make that argument is because actually the cost factor in personal and political terms is very, very different. So if you do something which is wrong and you screw it up, then it all comes back to you in spades. Whereas if you don't do anything, it appears you're less vulnerable on the accountability processes that we're taking. Just to give the media example I mentioned, I don't take the media as the kind of enemy in this regard. The media are far more likely to be publicly critical of those people who take an action than who don't take action in a given circumstance. There are exceptions to that, but I would say that is generally the case. Then the second thing is you have to really talk about responsibility. And one of the problems about oppositional politics, which I think we have with our adversarial system here, and in fact I'd say the same about the court system, is that it's very easy to get political support just by attacking those who have the responsibility. Now, the attacking may be justified. I mean, there are many people who don't carry out their responsibilities properly. But there used to be much more of a convention in this country of an understanding between at least the main political parties about trying to distinguish between the politician who'd really done something very stupid or the politician who was more caught in events as they moved along. But I think that you have to, maybe it's a question of publishing the list of issues which have been put in the too difficult box. And in a sense, at the national level, that's partly what this book is about. Each of the chapter headings is about a problem which is being put in the too difficult box rather than being properly dealt with. And one of the solutions that I suggest in my concluding chapter is that the main political party leaders, and it has to be them, should identify 3 or 4 of those issues and say, okay, can we agree to work together on sorting those problems out and not have the Punch and Judy response to every particular thing, but to try and carry it through. It's too much for the 25 or whatever to do it, but there are others where you could do it. And I'd say the same at the level of a given hospital or health trust, looking at an issue very directly and saying, what are we putting to one side? And what do we have to do to get agreement as to how we proceed is a very conscious political process which needs to happen. Now, it's often painful to happen, but it needs to happen. And the penalty for not solving a problem needs to become at least as great and probably greater as the penalty for solving it wrong, if you see what I mean. As I said in my list of issues, finding the right solution is very difficult. And you may easily go for the wrong solution. But does that mean you should go for no solution? Well, it doesn't. It means it's still often better to go for the wrong solution than to not try and solve the problem at all.
Lady towards the back there in the aisle raised her hand.
Hi, Pippa Sim, BBC News. I was just
From where, sorry, did you say?
BBC News. If indeed we are moving away from a two-party political system and coalition governments become more frequent, do you see the problems that you've set out becoming harder to solve in the long run?
Not really. I don't think the question of whether it's the coalition solves the question. I mean, all governments are coalitions in a very meaningful sense. The difference with this government, it's a formalised coalition between two parties which are different. But the issue for the kinds of problems that I've identified in the book is whether you can get agreement including the opposition as well as the government parties, whether they're two parties in the case of the coalition or just one. And that's what's really the prize that you have to try and achieve. I don't think people believe that this coalition, and this is not a point critical of the coalition, was formed in order to try and get an all-party approach to solving the problems of the country. It was simply the arithmetic which was determined by the 2010 election as being the only stable situation to deal with the economic problems the country was facing, and the desire there should be a stable government. And for what it's worth, I think it was a right decision. The suggestion that you could have had Labour and Lib Democrats and a string of small parties, I think would have been very difficult to sustain the economic programmes that were necessary to make the change. So I think it's a question of bringing all strands of opinion. That's why the idea of a constitutional convention is an interesting one when you talk about the constitution. The problem is, if you bring all opinion in, can you do it in a way which doesn't just go straight into the long grass and nothing further happens. So in this case of the Constitutional Convention, you convene the convention and it reports in 2023. And that's a real risk, as all the evidence of royal commissions and so on demonstrates. And that's a real problem. That depends on that's why I come back to the politics. The political leadership of the main parties has to be determined that they're going to crack on and deal with this. I would say the Leveson Committee on the phone hacking and so on was a reasonably successful example of a reasonably quick set of changes, which hasn't yet got an agreed solution, but is changing behaviour in some respects. David Lipsey, in what's an excellent chapter, talks about the Commission on Social Care and Old Age, which failed to get agreement, but as he describes in the book, pushed a lot of progress along the route. So I think my answer to the question is that the coalition needs to be wider than the coalition with a capital C that is this particular government. But that's not a criticism of this particular coalition. It's that if you want to solve these long-term issues, you've got to work together in a rather wider context.
I'll take the next few questions as pairs, if I may. Gentleman there and lady at the front on that side. Name and organisation, please.
Hi there, James Nation from the CBI. Excuse me. I just wondered, for those problems that do actually get out of the too difficult box, as it were, would you credit more political courage in a given instance, or would you credit more, to use two Macmillan attributed phrases, kind of events, dear boy, events, or the winds of change? Namely, do you think that for a problem to be solved, circumstances have to force it on the agenda? And maybe an example might be the peace process in Northern Ireland, or indeed what we've discussed earlier in terms of the further devolution question.
Lady at the front as well. Name and organisation, please.
Patricia Rochford, my own company, Rochford International. I'm actually wondering about the impact of lobbyists. You were talking about democracy and how it works, and you were saying how if people don't agree with the change, they're very vocal about it. But people who potentially have voted in a party on the basis of their agenda keep quite quiet. And the lobbyists are usually working for the people who are against them. So I'm wondering, what is their impact in slowing down major changes that's required?
Okay, two very good questions. Firstly, on your point, James, I do think political courage is a requirement in any of these circumstances. You need politicians who are ready to give it a go. Events are important, and they give the opportunity. That famous phrase, never waste a good crisis, is a very, very important one from this point of view. In my opinion, Labour wasted the 2008 financial crisis. There were a set of things that could have been done in 2009 on a number of these areas, which would have made a very material difference to how things work. But for various reasons, essentially because it was all seen as too difficult, it didn't happen. Obviously, if events reach a real crisis, as in Northern Ireland, then events force that to happen. But again, you go to the 2008 crisis, I could make a very strong argument that the reason why it happened was the failure of, before 2008, for the obvious weaknesses in the financial system and system of financial regulation to be resolved. There wasn't a great crisis. This was something, by the way, not the fault of the Labour government in particular. It was widely held across both many governments and many political parties. But because the problem wasn't solved, you still could have an enormous crisis as a consequence. But I say always try and use a crisis, but it's better that you don't get to the crisis before doing it. You should try and foresee what's going to come and deal with it. The CBI makes a whole string of arguments on infrastructure, take the third runway or whatever it may happen to be. There's a whole string of issues here about infrastructure development which are very problematic because of this. Whether High Speed 2 will ever happen or not, I don't know. It appears that both opposition and government are agreed on it at the moment. I support it. But there's a whole set of issues there where the long-term commitments of major infrastructure changes to the country require a broad agreement by all the major forces in politics that that's where they want to be. But I don't think you can do any of this just on the basis of events delivering it. I think politicians have to grab it, and that's why I use the phrase of politicians stepping up to the plate. Lobbyists are an interesting group of people. I had a period between 92 and 97 where I set up a small company when I called myself an anti-lobbyist. And my essential argument was that the lobby companies, I'm sure this wouldn't apply to anybody here, essentially lie to their clients by telling them that they, the lobby company, can get them access to the politicians, make the difference and all the rest of it, which I fundamentally think is untrue. I think actually the companies themselves, the trade unions, whatever organisation it is, can make their own case. And I actually argue the case even more strongly that lobbying shouldn't be a dirty word. It is the actual essence of democracy, is that people who are going to be affected by government actions or legislation should be able to make an argument about how they're being affected and carried it through. And that's what lobbyists, good lobbyists, will do. And I'm not against that at all. But there's absolutely no reason why politicians, government ministers, whoever, should agree with lobbyists. I mean, the case should be made, and the case should be heard, and the argument should be tested. But at the end of the day, you shouldn't just say, well, you've all said that. We're going to just abandon what we're doing. You should say, maybe you've got to change your proposal, maybe you've got to look at it in different ways. But there will be clashes of opinion about these things. And if you, meaning governments, political parties, just surrender to the fact there's a clash means we can't do anything, then nothing will ever be done. And so, going back to the political courage point that James made, somebody's got to say, no, we're going to carry it through.
Final few questions. Two people at the back.
Hello, James Bradley. Just in the context of the problem that's been identified, too difficult to deal with, I just wondered if I could just raise a couple of possible causes and get your comment on that. One being the relatively regular comment that the rise of the career politician over the conviction politician, whether that might be a cause for the issue, that people perhaps lack the courage, as was mentioned in the last question, that it's all about a career in politics rather than going into politics for a particular cause. And then secondly, the issue about communicating with the average citizen. If one was to take a typical person working in a supermarket in a town, that they just don't understand the issues. And I think that it could be a problem there that politicians maybe have switched off from the really sort of simple yes-no sort of questions and have shied away from that. That may be the source of the problem, that they feel that it's the inability to connect with people. Comparing the sort of the Margaret Thatchers, the Harold Wilsons with the the leaders of political parties today, perhaps. And maybe that is a reason for some of the issues causing this too difficult to deal with, perhaps.
Gentleman at the back.
Thank you. Tony Halmos from the City of London Corporation. I wonder if you could say something about the distinction between politicians, elected and otherwise, and civil servants. Because I obviously haven't read the book yet, but maybe it's in there. But to what extent is the problem that you're quite properly and seems to me rather effectively talking about caused also by issues to do with the civil service, how it works, who goes into it these days, and so on, or maybe always was like that, but certainly in its current form?
Again, two very good questions. Firstly, when I'm visiting professor, I say, at 2 or 3 universities, and students often, and I always give them 20 minutes, if they want to come and talk to me personally about their own ambitions for politics and all the rest of it, I talk to them about what they're about and what they're trying to achieve. And the first distinction which I always make is if you want to hold an office, for example, a Member of Parliament or to be Prime Minister, that's one reason. But it's not a very good reason. You should go into it because you have something you want to do, whether it's freedom or green or whatever it might happen to be that you want to do. And there are quite a lot of people who think it'd be fun to be an MP, but aren't able to answer the question, what would you do with your power as an MP? That's also true for politicians in Parliament today. There's a distinction between those people who really want to change society in a various way, conviction politicians you'd call them, and people who just want to hold office. I don't think that's a new thing at all. Anybody talking about the greasy pole or whatever in the 19th century would recognise that, and there are plenty of, if you read Disraeli's novels or whatever, there are people who are in politics in order to be an MP or whatever, rather than for a conviction reason. But I think conviction politics is where it has to start, and that is the core thing. But I don't think it's worse today than in other cases. What I do think is a weakness is because you have such a high number of politicians in safe seats who basically are going to be there for the rest of their lives, the motivation to drive for your conviction is often less, which is why I supported the alternative vote, to reduce the number of seats which are safe seats and to get a situation where there's more of an accountability of politicians. Which takes me to the second point. When I was an MP, we used to have regular meetings about this size in particular localities, talking about the issues of what were going on in that area. I didn't find at all, there are people who would disagree with this, but I didn't find at all either an unwillingness amongst ordinary people to talk about the problems that were concerning them, or a kind of naivete which said they only saw yes-no positions. They did understand that these were complicated questions. They were ready to discuss them in that kind of way. But what the key for it was to have more of a dialogue with the MPs themselves or their representatives, councillors or whoever about the particular questions. Of course, you'd always get people who say, no, you've got to do this, but that's the essence of it. It's why I argue in the book, in my final chapter, for more free votes in Parliament, because I think that for MPs to actually have discussions in their constituency with their constituents about some of the difficult questions which arise is a way to try and improve the dialogue that happens. And I do think you need MPs who are ready to communicate with average citizens effectively. Now, obviously, there have been massive issues, the most recent and famous being the MP's expenses scandal, which has set up a tremendous barrier between MPs and regular people. And one can talk about that at some length, why that happened and how it could be overcome and so on. But at the end of the day, you've got to promote those kind of communications. But actually, I would say MPs communicate far, far, far more today with their constituents than used to be the case even as recently as 30 or 40 years ago. It really wasn't uncommon for MPs to go and visit their constituency once or twice a year in those circumstances. No, it's not a joke. It's what went on. It would just be seen as completely unacceptable now as a way to go. So I do think the issues, James, I do think the issues you identified are correct issues to address. But I don't think the main problem on those areas is a lot worse today than it was, 25, 30 years ago. I should declare, Tony, that my father was a permanent secretary, and so I was brought up in a civil service culture, and I'm not one of those who just slags off the civil service. In fact, I think politicians who do slag off the civil service get it completely wrong, and it was my own experience as a minister too. What happens is if a politician and a government are very clear this is what we want to do, in general, in my opinion, the civil service works generally loyally to try and help the ministers do what they're trying to do and understand the issues. But by definition, their role is to say, have you thought about X or Y or Z? If you do this, the implementation problem, have you thought that how you're going to overcome that problem or whatever? And if the politician hasn't thought through properly how they're going to implement the question, then the civil servant becomes or the civil service even, becomes the butt of hostility as being the people who are blocking the change that everybody wants. Now, there is an issue, I used to think every time I went into the Home Office or the Education Department, on a Monday morning, almost everybody in those enormous departments lived within the M25 in a basically fairly middle-class approach in London, and that's how they are, and they don't get out much outside their normal circuit. And that's true of the media as well, the journalists. The only people who came in having talked to punters regularly across the country on the Monday morning were the ministers who, as MPs, had to have some dialogue with their constituents over the weekend about what was going on. And people used to talk to me a lot about whatever government was doing in lots of different areas. And I think politicians need to do that better. But I'm not in favour of saying that civil servants are the kind of block to all of this. There are occasions when what I'm saying is not true, that the civil servants are the block. But I don't think that's generically the problem.
Good, thank you. My apologies to anyone who may not have had an opportunity to answer the question, but I think we'll probably have a chance to mingle afterwards if you've got a few more minutes, Charles. So please join me in thanking Charles for that fascinating exposition.